The day my grandfather's will was read, my family celebrated with champagne before the lawyer even closed his briefcase. My uncle got the lake house. My aunt got the investment portfolio. My two cousins split the business accounts. And me, Emily, I got a folded piece of paper with a phone number written in my grandfather's handwriting and nothing else. No explanation, no money, no property, no letter attached. Just 10 digits in blue ink and the sound of my family already talking about where they would spend their shares. I sat at that table and did not cry. I did not argue. I just looked at that number and thought about every single Sunday I had spent at my grandfather's side while the rest of them were somewhere else. I thought about the meals I had cooked for him, the hospital appointments I had driven him to, the nights I had slept on his living room couch so he would not be alone after his surgery. And then I thought about how not one person at that table looked at me with anything close to guilt. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something honest. If you were sitting at that table, if you had given years of your life to someone who mattered deeply to you, and the people who showed up only at the end walked away with everything while you held a piece of paper, would you have made that call? Would you have dialed the number, or would the hurt have been too heavy? Think about that while I take you back to where this story really begins, because that phone number was not an accident, and my grandfather was not the kind of man who made mistakes. Emily was 31 years old when her grandfather, Harold, passed away on a Tuesday morning in early November. She found out through a text message from her mother, which said simply, "Dad is gone, funeral arrangements coming." There was no call, no warmth in the words, just information delivered the way someone would notify a distant coworker. Emily read the message twice, set her phone face down on her kitchen counter, and stood at the window for a long time watching the leaves fall from the oak tree in her backyard. She had known Harold was getting weaker. She had been the one watching it happen up close. For the last 4 years of Harold's life, Emily had been his closest companion. Not because anyone assigned her the role, not because there was a formal agreement or a family plan. It happened the way most invisible labor happens, quietly, gradually, and without applause. Emily lived 20 minutes from Harold's house. Her uncle David lived 45 minutes away and found reasons to make that distance feel like another country. Her Aunt Patricia lived an hour south and was deeply occupied with her social calendar, her book club, and her 2 adult children, Marcus and Renee, who were busy building lives that did not include elderly grandparents. Emily was the one who noticed when Harold started forgetting things. She was the one who called his doctor and sat with him during the first round of cognitive tests. She was the one who rearranged her own work schedule, scaled back her freelance design contracts, and started spending 3 days a week at Harold's house to make sure he was eating properly and taking his medications in the right order. She reorganized his kitchen. She labeled his pill bottles. She installed a better lock on the back door so he would not wander out at night, which had become a real concern after an incident in late spring 2 years before he died. During that time, Harold was still mostly himself. He was sharp in the mornings. He liked to sit at his kitchen table and talk about his life while Emily made them both coffee. He told her stories she had heard before and stories she had never heard, and she listened to all of them with the same attention because she understood that the act of listening was what he needed most. He told her about building his first business in his early 30s. He told her about the land he had purchased before property values climbed in their county. He told her about decisions he regretted and decisions that had quietly shaped everything that came after. Emily absorbed all of it. Not because she expected anything in return, because she loved him, the rest of the family appeared in bursts. Uncle David would call Harold on holidays and visit maybe 4 times a year, usually when there was something pleasant happening, a birthday, a mild summer weekend, a reason to come that felt festive rather than obligatory. Aunt Patricia was similar. She would arrive with flowers and commentary about how the house needed updating, spend 2 hours making conversation, and leave feeling satisfied that she had done her part. Marcus and Renee, Emily's cousins, treated Harold's house like a stop on a tour they were vaguely obligated to complete. They were not unkind. They were simply absent in all the ways that actually counted. Emily noticed this. She did not say much about it. It was not in her nature to maw. Kia seen over things she could not control. She told herself that people had different capacities, different lives, different relationships with obligation. She genuinely believed that about people. She was not bitter in those years. She was tired sometimes, and she felt lonely in her role occasionally, but she was not carrying resentment. She was simply doing what she felt was right. There were moments that tested her. A Saturday in October when Marcus called Harold to announce he was coming to visit, and Harold spent the whole morning in a good mood anticipating the visit, only for Marcus to cancel 2 hours before because something had come up. Emily watched Harold try to hide his disappointment and felt something quiet and sharp move through her chest. She did not call Marcus to express what she felt. She made Harold his favorite soup, and they watched old westerns together until he fell asleep in his chair. She covered him with a blanket and washed the dishes. There was a hospitalization in Harold's third-to-last year. A fall in the bathroom, a fractured wrist, a 2-week hospital stay that turned into 3 weeks because of a secondary infection. Emily was there almost every day. She coordinated with the nurses. She updated the family group chat where people mostly responded with heart emojis and the occasional praying for him. Uncle David visited once during those 3 weeks. Aunt Patricia came twice and spent one of those visits telling a nurse that the room needed to be warmer, and the other visit telling Emily that she really needed to think about her own health because she looked exhausted. Emily thanked her and meant it, even though the words felt like a door swinging shut on something she could not name. Harold recovered. He came home weaker than before and more dependent on Emily's presence than he had been. She adjusted again. She learned to handle the walker, the modified bathing routine, the slower meals, the increased doctor visits. She was present for all of it. She was not a saint. There were days she sat in her car in Harold's driveway and pressed her hands against the steering wheel and breathed until the weight in her chest loosened enough to let her go inside and be kind. But she always went inside. She was always kind. What Emily did not know during those years was that Harold was watching all of it. Not just witnessing it the way a passive observer might, but truly seeing it, cataloging it, feeling it in the particular way that very old men feel things when they understand their time is becoming finite. Harold was not confused about who showed up and who did not. He was not fooled by the holiday phone calls or the flower visits or the heart emojis in the group chat. He was a man who had spent decades in business, and he knew very clearly the difference between real presence and performed presence. He never spoke to Emily about what he was planning. He was private about his financial affairs in the way his generation often was, treating money as a subject too serious for casual conversation. Emily never asked. It was not her way. She was not helping Harold in order to receive anything, and she would have been genuinely embarrassed if he had tried to discuss it with her. What Harold did instead was make his decisions quietly and completely, with the same deliberate care he had applied to every important decision in his long life. He met with his attorney on 4 separate occasions in his final year. He was precise about what he wanted. He was specific about why. And then he waited to see if anything about his family would change enough to alter his thinking. It did not. Harold died on that Tuesday in November, peacefully, in his own bed, in the house he had lived in for 38 years. Emily had been there 3 days before and had stayed overnight because something in the way he was breathing had told her she should stay close. She had held his hand that night while he slept. She had told him she was glad he was her grandfather. She had meant every word. 2 days after she went home, he was gone. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday at the office of Harold's attorney, a calm and precise man named Gerald Whitmore who had handled Harold's affairs for over 20 years. Emily arrived on time, wearing a dark blue dress she had pressed carefully that morning, because Harold had always appreciated people who took care in how they presented themselves. She sat in one of the chairs along the right side of the conference table and watched her family fill the room around her. Uncle David arrived with his wife Sandra, who was wearing jewelry Emily had never seen before and who kept touching it in a particular way that suggested she already had plans for what came next. Aunt Patricia arrived 10 minutes late and apologized to no one in particular before taking a seat near the head of the table. Marcus and Renee came in together, Marcus on his phone until the last possible second. Renee scanning the room with an energy that was difficult to describe, except that it felt like expectation with very little patience underneath it. No one said much to Emily directly. There were vague gestures of acknowledgement, a nod from David, a brief touch on the shoulder from Renee that felt more like an accident than a comfort. Emily sat quietly and waited while Gerald Whitmore arranged his papers and cleared his throat and began to speak. The will was thorough. Harold had been meticulous. Gerald read through the preliminary language, and then moved into the specific distributions with a steady, professional voice. The lake house in Cedar County went to David, along with a designated cash account worth $280,000. The investment portfolio, which had been managed carefully over 40 years and carried a current value of just over $400,000, went to Patricia. The business accounts, which Harold had maintained even after his active years in business, were split evenly between Marcus and Renee, representing approximately $150,000 each. There were smaller provisions for a few longtime employees and a charitable donation to the hospital where Harold had received care. Then Gerald Whitmore paused. He looked up from the document and found Emily's face. His expression did not change, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel like he was measuring something carefully before continuing. He read the final line of the specific distributions. It stated that to his granddaughter Emily, Harold left a personal item, described as a handwritten note, which had been sealed and was to be opened by Emily privately after the reading. That was it. No dollar amount, no property, no account, just a sealed note. The room shifted in a way Emily felt before she saw it. David leaned slightly toward Sandra. Patricia made a small sound that was not quite a sigh but lived in the same neighborhood. Marcus looked at his phone. Renee looked at Emily with something that was trying to be sympathy, but was doing a poor job of hiding the relief underneath it. Gerald Whitmore produced a small sealed envelope from his file folder and set it gently on the table in front of Emily. Emily picked it up. She held it in both hands. She did not open it in front of them. The meeting wrapped quickly after that. There was procedural language about timelines and signatures and the next steps for asset transfer. Emily signed what she was asked to sign and sat quietly through the rest. She watched her uncle and aunt and cousins begin to breathe differently now that the numbers were confirmed, a particular kind of relaxation that comes when expected wealth is made official. They were not cruel about it in her presence. They simply behaved as people who had received what they expected and were already thinking about what came next. David did shake Emily's hand before he left and said something like, "Harold always did things his own way," in a tone that was meant to sound philosophical, but carried the subtle texture of an apology for something he did not feel guilty about. Patricia hugged her briefly and said, "You were so good to him, sweetheart," which was true and meant genuinely and also did absolutely nothing to address the reality of what had just happened in that room. Marcus nodded at her on the way out. Renee said, "Call me if you need anything," which Emily understood to mean nothing specific. And then they were gone. And Emily was sitting in the parking lot of Gerald Whitmore's office building, alone in her car, holding the sealed envelope. She opened it there. She did not wait until she got home. She tore the seal carefully along the top edge and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. Inside was a note in her grandfather's handwriting, which she recognized immediately. It was the handwriting of a man who had learned penmanship in a different era, careful and clear and slightly formal even in its personal moments. The note was short. It said this. It said that he knew what she had done for him. It said that he saw every morning she drove to his house, and every night she stayed longer than she planned, and every appointment she managed, and every worry she carried quietly so he would not feel like a burden. It said she had been the truest presence in his life during the years when presence was the only thing that mattered. And then it said that before she left the parking lot, she should call the number written at the bottom of the page. It said the person who answered would explain what he had arranged. It said he was sorry for keeping it private for so long, but he knew her, and he knew that if she had suspected anything, she would have done everything differently, and he needed her to keep doing things the way she always had. The number was written at the bottom in the same careful hand. Emily read the note 3 times. Then she sat very still for a moment. Then she dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a woman answered. Her name was Catherine Holloway. She introduced herself as a private estate attorney who was not affiliated with Gerald Whitmore or the public will that had been read that afternoon. She explained that Harold had retained her services separately and privately, beginning approximately 14 months before his death. She explained that there was a second estate structure. She explained that Harold had legally and deliberately separated a significant portion of his assets into a private trust established solely for Emily, kept entirely apart from the assets that had gone through his general estate. Emily did not speak for a long moment after Catherine Holloway finished her initial explanation. Then she asked one question. She asked if what Catherine was describing was legal and legitimate. Catherine confirmed that it was entirely legal, that Harold had taken extraordinary care to ensure it was structured correctly, and that Gerald Whitmore had been fully aware of the existence of a separate private arrangement without being involved in its specifics, which was why he had been able to execute the public will honestly without disclosing what he was not a party to. Catherine asked Emily if she could come to her office the following Monday morning to begin the review process. Emily said yes. She drove home in silence. She did not call anyone. She did not text anyone. She did not post anything or reach out to a single member of her family. She made herself dinner, sat at her kitchen table, and read her grandfather's note one more time before putting it away in the small wooden box on her bookshelf where she kept the things that mattered most to her. She did not sleep very well that night, but not because she was sad. She was processing something large and quiet that did not yet have a clear shape. The following Monday, Emily sat in Catherine Holloway's office and listened for 2 hours. What Harold had built in that private trust was not a small gesture. It was the result of 40 years of careful investment in land, specifically rural and agricultural parcels that he had acquired at various points in his life and held without ever discussing them publicly, even with his family. The land parcels were spread across 3 counties. Several had appreciated dramatically over the decades due to regional development, infrastructure projects, and agricultural demand. The combined assessed value of the trust assets, including the land holdings and several private investment accounts Harold had opened specifically under the trust structure, was just under $2.4 million. Emily sat with that number for a long time while Catherine continued speaking. It did not feel real at first. It felt like a category of information that belonged to someone else's life. But Catherine was patient and clear, and she walked Emily through each asset one by one, explaining what Harold had put where and why, and gradually the number became real and solid and connected to something Emily could actually hold in her mind. Harold had also included a longer letter in the trust documents. Emily read it privately after the meeting, sitting in her car in the parking lot of Catherine's office building, which had the strange quality of now being the second important parking lot in this story of her life. The letter was longer than the note and much more specific. In it, Harold explained his thinking in detail. He wrote that he had watched his family for a long time and had seen the difference between the people who wanted to be near him and the people who wanted to be near what he had. He wrote that he was not angry at any of them because wanting things is human and he did not believe in punishing human nature. But he also wrote that he believed in honoring what was real, and what was real was Emily. He wrote that he had kept the trust private not to be dramatic, but to protect it. He knew his family. He knew that if they had known the trust existed, the final years of his life would have become something else entirely. He did not want that. He wanted things to continue as they had been. He wanted Emily to keep coming because she wanted to come, not because she was managing an inheritance. He needed to know, until the very end, that she was there because she loved him. And she was. He wrote that he knew she was. He wrote one more thing that Emily would think about for a long time after that afternoon. He wrote that she had spent too many years being the person everyone leaned on without anyone asking what she needed. He wrote that this was over now. He wrote that she had built something in him by being present, and he was giving something back that was built in the same spirit, not as payment, but as recognition. He wrote that he hoped she would use it to build something of her own and stop making herself small so others could be comfortable. Emily folded the letter. S. He sat quietly for a while. Then she drove home and cooked herself a good meal and slept better than she had in months. She told no one for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, she met with Catherine Holloway twice more to understand the full scope of the assets and begin the process of formally receiving them. She also met with a financial advisor. Catherine recommended to begin thinking through what managing this kind of wealth would actually look like in practice. She learned things about land management and investment accounts and tax structures that she had never needed to know before. She paid close attention to all of it. Emily was the kind of person who paid close attention when it mattered. She also lived her regular life. She went to work on her design clients. She went to the grocery store. She had coffee with her friend Joanne, who had been her closest friend since college and who was the only person in Emily's orbit who had ever witnessed the full reality of what Emily had given to Harold's care without making her feel like she needed to minimize it. Emily did not tell Joanne yet either. She needed the knowledge to feel fully settled inside her before she shared it with anyone. What she was aware of, during those 3 weeks, was her family beginning to move through their own version of a post-will adjustment. She saw it happening from a distance because the family group chat was active in ways it had not been before Harold's death. David sent a photo of the lake house with a caption about plans to renovate. Patricia shared an article about investment strategies, presumably in relation to her new portfolio. Marcus posted something vague about expansion plans for a side business he had been working on. There was an energy in the chat that felt like money beginning to change hands, or at least beginning to be counted. No one in that chat asked Emily how she was doing. No one mentioned the note she had received. No one referenced what had happened in the conference room at Gerald Whitmore's office. The group chat went on as though Emily had received something normal rather than something so different from what everyone else got that it did not even belong in the same category. She noticed this. She did not react to it. She kept her phone in her pocket and kept meeting with Catherine Holloway and kept paying attention to the important conversations. The call came on a Wednesday evening, 3.5 weeks after the will reading. It was from David. He called rather than texted, which was unusual, and Emily answered because she always answered family calls. David's voice was friendly in a way that had a particular texture she recognized. He asked how she was doing. She said fine, thank you. He said he had been thinking about her a lot lately and hoped she was okay given everything. She thanked him. Then he said he wanted to bring something up gently and that he hoped she would take it in the spirit it was intended. He said that the family had been talking, meaning himself and Patricia, and they felt that Harold's estate had perhaps not been distributed in a way that fully reflected Emily's contributions. They felt, he said, that this was an awkward topic, but an important one. He said that they were thinking, and again he wanted her to take this gently, that perhaps Emily might feel better if they each contributed a small amount from their own distributions to give Emily something more meaningful. A gesture, he called it, a family gesture. He said he had already spoken to Patricia about it, and she agreed. Emily listened to all of this carefully. She asked a few clarifying questions in a neutral tone. She wanted to understand exactly what David was proposing. It became clear, as he continued, that the proposal was for Emily to receive a relatively small sum, something in the range of $30,000 to $40,000 split between David and Patricia as a voluntary gesture, with the understanding that this was a private family matter and not something that needed to involve the attorney or any formal documentation. Emily thanked David for the call. She said she appreciated that he had reached out. She said she needed a few days to think about things and would be in touch. She hung up the phone and stood in her kitchen for a moment, thinking about what had just happened. The call told her several things. It told her that David and Patricia were experiencing something, possibly guilt, possibly awareness that they looked a certain way in the context of Emily's contribution. It told her they wanted to resolve that feeling with a private, undocumented, relatively modest gesture that would cost them very little compared to what they had received and would likely relieve them of whatever discomfort they were carrying. It told her they were not thinking about what Emily had given. They were thinking about how they felt and how to feel better. It also told her they had no idea about the trust. She did not call David back. For 5 days, when she did, she told him she appreciated the thought but that she was doing all right and didn't need the gesture. She said Harold had made his wishes clear and she respected them. She said she hoped the lake house renovation was going well. David sounded slightly confused by this response, perhaps expecting either more gratitude or more distress. Emily gave him neither. She said goodbye warmly and ended the call. 2 days after that, she called Catherine Holloway and told her she was ready to proceed with the full transfer process. She had made her decisions about the first steps she wanted to take with the trust assets. She had decided to keep the land parcels, at least initially, while she learned more about managing them. She had decided to work with a property management firm Catherine recommended who had experience with agricultural land in the region. She had also decided to use a portion of one of the liquid accounts to pay off the remaining balance on her own home, which was a quiet and practical form of freedom that she was going to allow herself without any performance about it. The trust transfer process was not instant. It involved signatures and filings and coordination between Catherine's office and various financial institutions. It took weeks, but it moved steadily. Emily was learning to be patient with processes that were large and slow because the outcome was worth the pace. During this time, the family situation continued to develop in ways that Emily watched with a kind of quiet, clear attention. Renee reached out via text in early December, asking if Emily wanted to get together for coffee. Emily agreed, and they met at a cafe near Emily's neighborhood on a Thursday afternoon. Renee was warm in the way she had always been, which was to say genuinely pleasant on the surface and somewhat evasive about anything real underneath. They talked about Harold and about the holidays and about Renee's job and about a few other things. Renee did not bring up the will reading directly. She danced near it once, saying something like, "I hope you're not too down about how things worked out." And Emily said she was doing well, which was true, and moved the conversation along. What Emily noticed was that Renee's visit felt like reconnaissance. Not malicious reconnaissance, but the kind of checking in that people do when they are uncertain about someone's emotional state and want to assess it. Renee was measuring something. Emily was not sure exactly what Renee expected to find. Perhaps sadness, perhaps bitterness, perhaps a version of Emily who was struggling and needed comfort. What she found instead was a woman who was warm and calm and gave nothing specific away. Emily did not lie to Renee during that coffee. She simply chose what she shared, which is something she had always had the right to do. The holidays that year were the quietest of Emily's adult life, and she discovered that quiet had a different quality than she expected. She spent Christmas with Joanne's family, which was loud and chaotic and full of children and a dog that knocked over the Christmas tree twice before noon, and Emily felt more relaxed than she had in years. She called David and Patricia briefly to exchange holiday greetings. She texted Marcus and Renee. She kept all of it cordial and brief. She was not cold. She was simply not performing warmth she was not feeling. On New Year's Eve, she sat in her living room with a glass of wine and thought carefully about the year behind her and the one ahead. She was, by that point, a woman with significant assets that no one in her family knew about. She was also a woman who had spent 4 years being deeply, genuinely useful to someone she loved, and who was only now beginning to understand that the value of that had never depended on anyone else recognizing it. Harold had recognized it. He had done so in the most concrete and private way he could imagine, and the privacy of it had been its own kind of love because it meant he had seen her as she was, not as he wanted her to be convenient. She wrote in her journal that night. She wrote several things, but the clearest was this. She was not angry. She had expected to be angrier than she was, but what she felt was more like clarity. Like a lens that had been slightly out of focus for a long time and had finally adjusted. She could see her family clearly now, not as villains and not as heroes, but as people who had made choices and were living inside the consequences of those choices, even if they did not know the full shape of those consequences yet. January came. With it came something Emily had not anticipated. The land parcels that Harold had left in the trust were located in 3 counties, and 2 of them were in a region that had been drawing significant interest from a regional development group that was planning a large mixed-use project in the area. Emily's property manager had flagged this early in January as something worth watching. By the 3rd week of January, Emily had received a formal inquiry from the development group's acquisition team asking about the availability of 2 of her parcels for potential purchase or long-term lease negotiation. The numbers in the initial inquiry were not small. They were, in fact, considerably larger than the assessed values Catherine had cited during their early meetings, because the development interest had pushed the market value of land in that corridor upward significantly. Emily discussed this with Catherine and with her financial advisor and with the property manager. She was not in a rush. She had been told by people she was learning to trust in this new world that patience in land negotiation was a real and practical advantage. She did not make any decisions immediately. She gathered information. She asked questions. She learned. What she did not do was tell her family. The reason was not cruelty. The reason was simple and rational. The trust was private. It had been made private deliberately. Harold had structured it that way because he knew his family, and Emily, who had also grown up knowing her family, now understood exactly what he had understood. The moment this information entered the family space, everything would change. There would be feelings about fairness. There would be suggestions about how the assets should be managed. There would possibly be legal questions, not legitimate ones, but questions designed to create enough noise and uncertainty to extract something. Emily did not think her family was evil. She thought they were human, and she knew what this particular group of humans would do with the information, so she kept it private. Not forever. But for now, February was when things began to shift in a more visible direction. It started with Marcus. Marcus had taken his share of the business accounts and invested in an expansion of the side business he had been building for a couple of years, a logistics and delivery coordination company that was small but growing. He had used the inheritance money to hire staff and upgrade equipment and signed several new contracts. Emily learned this through the family group chat, where Marcus posted updates occasionally with a confidence that had grown noticeably since the inheritance. But in mid-February, Marcus ran into trouble. One of his major new contracts fell through when the client company he had signed with experienced its own financial difficulties and suspended operations. It was not Marcus's fault, but it left him exposed because he had committed to expenses based on the projected revenue from that contract. He needed to cover a gap quickly. He called Emily on a Saturday morning. He was direct about the situation, which Emily appreciated because Marcus at his best was at least straightforward. He explained what had happened. He said he was short about $40,000 and needed to bridge the gap for approximately 3 months while he renegotiated his remaining contracts and brought in new business. He asked if Emily could lend him the money. Emily asked him how much his share of Harold's estate had come to before he had invested it. He told her because the number was what it was. She did some mental arithmetic. The gap he was describing was not something that should have been unavoidable given where he had started 4 months earlier. He had moved faster than was wise. She recognized this pattern because she had watched Marcus make similar choices in previous situations, moving quickly with money and then needing someone to catch him. She told him she needed to think about it and would call him back by Tuesday. He said okay, but she could hear the expectation underneath the okay. The same expectation that had always lived in the interactions between them, that Emily would ultimately come through because Emily always came through. She called Catherine on Monday morning, not to ask for legal advice specifically, but to think through the situation out loud with someone clear-headed. Catherine listened and then said something useful, which was that whatever Emily decided had to be a decision Emily could live with regardless of how Marcus responded to it, and that if Emily lent the money, she needed to do it with documentation or not do it at all. Emily called Marcus back on Tuesday as promised. She told him she was not in a position to lend the money right now. She told him this simply and without elaborate explanation. Marcus was quiet for a moment and then said he understood, though his voice said something slightly different. He said he would figure it out. Emily said she hoped he would and that she was rooting for him. She hung up and felt something move through her chest that was not quite guilt and not quite satisfaction, but existed somewhere between the two. She had always been the one who found a way to help. She was finding, slowly and deliberately, that the version of helping she had practiced her whole life, kind that required her to make herself smaller so others could have more room, was not actually kindness. It was a habit. And habits, even deeply comfortable ones, can be examined and changed. March brought a new development that Emily had not anticipated, and that changed the texture of everything that followed. Renee called on a Wednesday evening, and unlike the exploratory coffee meeting in December, this call had a specific purpose. Renee had been talking to a real estate agent about selling a property she owned, a small commercial unit she had purchased several years earlier using her own savings. During those conversations, the agent had mentioned something about land values in the region. The agent had mentioned, specifically, a certain corridor of rural parcels that had been drawing development interest. The agent had mentioned several of the parcel locations by name or general area. 2 of those locations matched the parcels in Emily's trust. Renee had not connected the dots yet. She was calling Emily to share what she had learned as general information, the way people share interesting news, because she thought it might be relevant to Emily since Emily had grown up hearing Harold talk about land and property. She did not know the parcels were Emily's. She was simply passing along information she found interesting, and that had Harold's name loosely attached to it in the way that real estate conversations sometimes work their way back to whoever owned the land originally. Emily listened carefully. She confirmed nothing. She asked a few neutral questions that were genuinely curious rather than revealing. She thanked Renee for sharing and said she would keep that in mind. After she hung up, She sat for a long time thinking about timing and about the fact that land values and development interests have a way of becoming public knowledge eventually, and eventually was probably not as far away as she might have hoped. She called Catherine the next morning. She told Catherine what Renee had said. Catherine was thoughtful on the other end of the line. She said that the trust itself was protected and that Emily's ownership of the assets was private but not secret, meaning that a determined person with the right knowledge and enough motivation could potentially piece things together. She said there was no legal risk to Emily's ownership, but she said that if family members discovered the trust existence before Emily was ready to have that conversation, the conversation would happen on their terms rather than hers. Emily asked Catherine how much time she likely had before the development inquiry became more visible in the public record. Catherine said it depended on how quickly the acquisition process moved, but that in her experience, these things tended to surface in local business reporting or property filing records within a few months of formal negotiations beginning. Emily thought about this for a day. Then, she made a decision that surprised even herself a little. She decided to control the timeline. She decided that she would tell her family about the trust herself, at a moment of her own choosing, in a way that was honest and clear and left no room for the narrative to be shaped by panic or accusation or someone else's version of events. She was not going to do it yet. She was going to do it when the moment was right. But she was going to be the one to decide when that moment arrived. April came with a specific new pressure. David called Emily, not with another soft gesture proposal this time, but with something more complicated. David had begun his lake house renovation and had discovered during the initial work that there were structural issues with the foundation of the east wing of the property that were significantly more expensive to address than his renovation budget had allowed for. He had already committed to contractors and had already spent a substantial portion of his initial renovation budget on the preliminary work before the structural issue was uncovered. He needed money. Not a gift, he was careful to say, but a loan against the lake house property itself, which would require either a bank transaction that he was having difficulty getting approved quickly or a private arrangement with a family member. He was asking Emily. Emily listened to this explanation with the same neutral attention she had brought to Marcus's call in February. She asked a few questions. She clarified the amounts he was discussing. She noted that the amount David was asking to borrow was more than twice what he had offered her as a generous family gesture back in November. She noted this internally without saying it out loud. She told David she would think about it. He said he was on something of a time pressure with the contractors. She said she understood time pressure and that she would get back to him in a few days. She called Joanne that evening. Not for advice specifically, just to talk to someone who knew her and who would help her stay grounded. Joanne listened and then said, with the directness that had always made her Emily's most valuable friend, that it sounded to her like the people who had received hundreds of thousands of dollars were coming to the person who received a piece of paper for financial assistance within 6 months of the inheritance, and that something about that picture deserved to be named clearly. Emily laughed for the first time in several weeks. Not bitterly, but genuinely, because Joanne had a way of reducing things to their actual shape. She called David back after 3 days and told him she was not able to provide a private loan at this time, but that she was happy to help him think through his options with his bank or a commercial lender if he wanted to talk through the process. She was kind about it. She was honest about it. She did not explain herself further than that. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Emily, can I ask you something directly?" She said yes. He said, "Is something going on with you that we should know about? You seem different." Emily considered that question carefully. Then she said that she was doing well, that she had been doing a lot of thinking since Harold died, and that she was in a place of real clarity about what she wanted her life to look like going forward. She said she hoped he would find a good solution for the lake house. She said goodbye with warmth. After she hung up, she sat with what David had said. "You seem different." She thought about whether different was accurate. She decided it was not quite right. She did not feel different. She felt more like herself than she had in a long time. She felt like the version of herself that had always existed beneath all the accommodation and quiet labor and management of other people's comfort. That version had not gone anywhere. She had just been busy being useful. In early May, the development inquiry on her land parcels progressed to a more formal stage. The acquisition team for the development group had submitted a formal letter of intent to purchase the 2 parcels in question at a price significantly above what Emily had anticipated even after the initial inquiry. The letter went to Catherine's office, and Catherine called Emily immediately. The number in the letter of intent was, combined across the 2 parcels, $1.1 million. Emily read the letter in Catherine's office. She sat with it in the same way she had sat with every large piece of information in this year, carefully, without rushing, allowing it to settle before she decided anything. She told Catherine she needed a week before she responded to the intent. Catherine said that was a reasonable and professionally appropriate response timeline and that she would communicate it accordingly. Emily drove home and called Joanne. She told Joanne everything, all of it. The trust, the number from the will reading, the note, Catherine Holloway, the land parcels, the development inquiry, the letter of intent, all of it. She needed someone who knew her fully to hold the full picture with her for a while before she took the next step. Joanne listened to the entire story without interrupting. When Emily finished, there was a brief silence. Then Joanne said, "Harold knew exactly what he was doing." Emily said she had started to understand that more and more every week. Joanne asked what Emily was going to do next. Emily said she was going to accept the offer on the parcels, continue managing the remaining trust assets, and then she was going to tell her family about the trust. Joanne asked when. Emily said soon. She said she would know the exact moment when it arrived. The moment arrived on a Saturday in late May. The whole family had gathered for what Patricia had organized as a memorial gathering for Harold, a kind of informal event held at Patricia's house with food and photographs, and some conversation about Harold's memory. It was a good instinct on Patricia's part, and Emily had been glad to receive the invitation because she had wanted to mark Harold's memory in a shared way with her family and had not been sure how to create that opportunity. She drove to Patricia's house with a small dish of food she had prepared, one of Harold's favorite recipes, a simple bean and vegetable stew that he had taught her to make when she was a teenager. She arrived and sat with her family and ate and talked about Harold and looked at the photographs Patricia had laid out on the dining table, pictures from Harold's early life, his business years, his family years. Emily found a photograph she had never seen before, Harold at maybe 35, standing in a field with a wide sky behind him, looking directly at the camera with an expression she recognized as satisfaction. He had looked like that sometimes when they sat at his kitchen table in the mornings, and the light was coming in right, and the coffee was good, and everything was quiet. After the food and the converse. Asian had settled into a comfortable lull, when everyone was still at the table with their coffee cups and the kind of gentle tiredness that comes after remembering someone you loved. Emily said she had something she wanted to share with the family. She said Harold had left her some instructions along with the note at the will reading, and that she had spent the past several months following those instructions, and that she felt it was time to let them know what that had involved. She did not perform this. She did not build to it dramatically. She spoke in the same clear, calm voice she had used with Marcus when she declined to lend money, and with David when she explained she was not a source of private loans. She described the trust clearly and factually. She explained that Harold had established it separately and privately over the course of many years. She explained its general scope without giving specific numbers at first. She explained that she had been working with an attorney to manage and receive the assets over the past several months. She said she was sharing this now because she felt the family deserved to know and because she would rather they hear it from her than from a filing or a news report about the development project. The room was very quiet when she finished. David's face did something complicated. He went through several expressions in a short period of time, and Emily watched them the way she had learned to watch things this year, with clarity and without flinching. Patricia set her coffee cup down on the table with a small, careful movement that suggested her hands were not quite steady. Marcus looked at the middle of the table. Renee looked at Emily with something that Emily thought might be the beginning of genuine understanding, though she could not be certain. Then David said, "Emily." "How much?" Emily answered him honestly. She told him the general asset value of the trust as Harold had structured it. She did not tell him about the letter of intent yet because that was still in process. She was honest about what was relevant to share and calm about what was not yet finalized. David said, "And you've had this since November." Emily said yes, that she had been working with an attorney since November to understand it and begin managing it properly. Tricia said, Harold never told us. Emily said no, he had chosen to keep it private, and she had respected that choice, Marcus said. So while we were all adjusting to what we got, you had this the whole time. Emily said she had been receiving information and working through a process. Yes, there was another silence. Then David said something that was the most honest thing he had said to Emily in perhaps a decade. He said, "We treated you like the one who got the least." And Harold knew that's what we would do. Emily did not respond to that immediately. She let it sit in the room. Then she said quietly that she thought Harold knew a lot of things about all of them, and that he had made the choices that made sense to him based on what he knew. Renee was the first person to speak after that. She said, "Emily, I want to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me." Emily said, "Okay." Renee said, "Were you angry at us all those months?" Emily thought about this carefully before answering because it deserved a careful answer. She said that she had spent a long time making peace with the gap between what she gave and what was seen, and that the trust had not changed how she felt about the giving. She said she had not been angry in the way Renee might expect. She had been clear, and clarity and anger are not the same thing. Patricia said, "I'm sorry, Emily. I think we were thoughtless." Emily thanked her for saying it. She meant the thanks. The rest of that afternoon was different from any family time Emily could remember. Something had shifted in the room that was not revenge and was not triumph. It was more like a correction. Like furniture in a house that had been arranged slightly wrong for years, and someone had finally noticed and moved things back to where they made sense. David pulled Emily aside before she left and asked her directly if she needed anything, and she recognized that the question came from a different place than it had before. She told him she was doing well and that she was figuring things out. He said he was glad, and then he said something that stayed with her on the drive home. He said Harold had always told him that the most expensive thing in the world is underestimating the person who shows up. Emily drove home through the early summer evening with the windows down and the warm air coming through the car. She thought about Harold in that field in the photograph, with the wide sky behind him and the satisfied look on his face. She thought about Sunday mornings at his kitchen table. She thought about the pill bottles she had labeled, and the couch she had slept on, and the westerns they had watched, and the hands she had held. She thought about the note written in his careful handwriting at the bottom of a piece of folded paper, and the phone number, and the sound of Catherine Holloway's voice answering 2 rings in, professional and ready. She thought about the letter of intent sitting in Catherine's office waiting for her signature decision. She thought about the financial advisor she was meeting on Monday morning. She thought about the property manager who had already suggested 2 additional conversations about the remaining parcels and what the right long-term strategy might be. She thought about the life she was building that did not look the way she had expected her life to look, and she recognized that this was not a loss but a different kind of arrival. She had arrived at something real. She had not come here through approval-seeking or by making herself convenient or by being the person everyone leaned on when they needed the floor held steady. She had come here through years of showing up when it mattered, which had been seen by the one person whose seeing had turned out to be enough. She did not need the family to fully understand that. It would be nice if they did. Some of them might, over time, but their understanding was no longer the thing her life was organized around. When she got home, she called Catherine and left a message saying she was ready to discuss the letter of intent in detail on Monday after the financial advisor meeting. She stood in her kitchen and looked at the oak tree in her backyard, which was full and green in the early summer air. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at her kitchen table alone and let the quiet of the evening be quiet. She opened her journal and wrote one line. She wrote, "Harold was right. I should stop making myself small." She closed the journal. She drank her tea. She let herself be full of all the things she had earned by being exactly who she was. The months that followed were not without complication, because real life does not resolve itself simply once the main revelation has passed. There were practical realities to navigate. The letter of intent went through a negotiation process that took several additional weeks before Emily and Catherine reached terms that Emily was satisfied with. The final sale price for the 2 parcels was slightly below the initial letter of intent figure, but still represented a number that changed Emily's financial landscape in concrete and lasting ways. The remaining land parcels were placed under a management structure that the property manager helped design, and Emily began learning the language of agricultural leasing, seasonal tenancy agreements, and regional development planning in a way she had not expected to need, but found genuinely interesting. She had always been someone who learned things thoroughly when they mattered, and this mattered. She also began thinking seriously about the design business she had scaled back during Harold's care years. She had kept her hand in it, maintaining a small set of clients, but she had not built it the way she once planned because she had always had more pressing obligations pulling her attention. With those obligations lifted, and with a financial foundation that removed the immediate pressure of income survival, she found herself thinking about her work differently. She was thinking about what she actually wanted to build rather than what she could afford to offer. She hired an assistant in July. A part-time arrangement with a young designer named Sophia, who was sharp and reliable and reminded Emily a little of herself at 24, eager to learn and quietly determined. Emily found that she liked having someone to teach. It was a different kind of showing up, one that was reciprocal rather than one-directional, and she settled into it with something that felt like relief. David did resolve his lake house situation eventually through a combination of a bank arrangement and scaling back the renovation scope. He did not ask Emily again. They spoke occasionally, and the conversations were different now, more careful and more honest in the way that conversations become after something significant has been named. Emily did not hold what had happened against David in an active way. She held it as information, as part of the full picture of who he was and what their relationship could realistically be. That was enough. Marcus stabilized his business by bringing in a new partner and renegotiating his client contracts more conservatively. He did not call Emily again about money. He did check in occasionally with a text or a brief call, and Emily responded warmly because she meant it. She was not freezing any of them out. She was simply present in a different way, a way that was on her terms rather than shaped by what anyone needed from her. Renee was the family member who surprised Emily the most in the months that followed. Renee called in August and asked if they could have lunch, a real lunch with real conversa. Tian, Emily agreed. They met at a restaurant near Emily's office and spent 2 hours talking in a way they had never quite managed before. Renee was honest in a way that was slightly uncomfortable for her, but that she pushed through anyway, and Emily respected the effort of that. Renee said she had been thinking a lot since the gathering at Patricia's house, thinking about what she had taken for granted and what she had chosen to not see because it was easier. She said she was not sure she could fully explain why she had been so peripheral to Harold's care, except that she had told herself a story about Emily being the person who handled those things, and she had let that story do her work for her. Emily listened to this. She said she understood the mechanism Renee was describing because she was familiar with it from the other side. She said she did not need Renee to spend the rest of her life apologizing, but she did appreciate her naming it clearly. Renee said she hoped they could build something more real going forward. Emily said she hoped so too, and she meant it. There is something that happens to a person when they stop organizing their life around being needed and start organizing it around what they actually value, and Emily experienced this shift gradually over the course of that first year after Harold's death. It was not dramatic. It was not a single morning when she woke up transformed. It was a series of small decisions, each slightly clearer than the last, each one reducing the gap between who she was and how she was living. By the end of that year, she was running a growing design practice, managing a land portfolio that had generated more value than she had ever imagined owning, and living in the house she had paid off, which felt physically different to her in a way she had not expected, as though the walls had changed their meaning. She visited Harold's grave on the anniversary of his death. She went alone, early in the morning before the day got busy, and she stood quietly for a while with the November air cold around her and the oak leaves already down from the trees. She told him about the parcels and about Catherine and about Sophia and about the oak tree in her backyard. She told him about David and Marcus and Renee and Patricia, honestly, because he deserved honesty. She told him she had made her first real investment decision from the trust assets this week, and that she had done it calmly and with good information, and she thought he would have approved of the process if not necessarily the specific choice. She told him she had stopped making herself small. She told him it was harder than it sounded, even now, even with everything. She told him she was still learning. She thanked him for the note. She thanked him for the phone number. She thanked him for the 4 years of Sunday mornings, and for the westerns they had watched, and for every single time he had told her one of his stories like it was the most important story in the world. She thanked him for seeing her. She drove home through the November morning feeling lighter than the season should have allowed. She had a meeting with Sophia at 10, and a call with her financial advisor at 1 and a dinner with Joanne at 7. She had a full day ahead of her that was entirely her own, built from choices she had made and things she had earned, and a version of herself she no longer apologized for. She thought about the first time she had dialed that phone number, sitting in her car in the parking lot of Gerald Whitmore's office building, holding a piece of paper with 10 digits and a grandfather's handwriting and nothing else visible to anyone on the outside. She thought about what it had felt like to press call, uncertain and exhausted and determined, and the 2 rings and the professional voice on the other end, and how everything had shifted direction from that moment in a way she could never have planned. She thought about how her family had raised their glasses of champagne with the briefcase still closing, and how they had each received a number with a dollar sign in front of it and had called it the full story. She thought about how a phone number had looked like nothing at all compared to that. She understood now, as she had been slowly understanding since November of the year before, that her grandfather had given her something that could not be raised in a glass or divided or spent quickly or leveraged for a contractor or deposited and forgot. He had given her the specific shape of his recognition. He had seen her and he had arranged everything around that seeing, patiently, privately, and with the full belief that she would still be herself when she finally found out she was. She was more herself than she had been in years. She was, for the first time in a long time, exactly where she had always been worth being. Before you close this out, I want to leave you with a question that I think about more than I expected to. Harold saw Emily. Clearly for years before he ever acted on what he saw. He watched and waited and trusted that the real picture would eventually become visible to everyone who needed to see it. So here is what I am asking you to sit with. Is there someone in your life right now who is being the Emily, the one who shows up quietly, the one whose effort gets called convenient instead of valuable, the one who would get the folded piece of paper while everyone else raised a glass? And more importantly, are you doing anything with what you see? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This story belongs to everyone who has ever been the one who stayed.